Hey, welcome back. It's really nice to have you here. Or if this is your first time, I'm glad you found your way to this little corner of the night. Tonight, I'm going to tell you a story about lords and royals, the powerful, wealthy figures of the medieval world. No rush, just a slow, gentle walk through the past. If my stories help you feel more at ease, I'd love for you to subscribe. And for those who want more, I'm sharing ad-free, members-only videos every other night starting tomorrow. Before we begin, let me know in the comments, where are you listening from and what time is it for you? It always amazes me how people from all over the world come together through something this quiet. Take a breath and let's begin. His name was Lord America Vale, and yes, he was rich. The kind of rich that made men nod before they knew his name. The kind that got you forgiven faster than a priest's whisper. The kind of rich that came with land, linen, and leisure, and yet still never seemed to come with peace. He woke before sunrise. Not from duty, from habit. Rich men were not supposed to have habits. They were supposed to have servants with better ones. But America had spent too many years pretending to enjoy being waited on. He found the act of not being needed almost insulting. So he dressed himself slowly, methodically, in layers of wool and velvet that had been stitched by hands. He paid well and never looked directly in the eye. The manor was silent, except for the coals crackling in the hearth and the soft brush of slippers on stone. A servant passed by, nodded, said nothing. In a rich house, silence was the first rule. The rich hated being reminded that they were surrounded by people who had to love them, or risk starving. Alenga, fruit, bread that was too white to be trusted. He tapped one finger against the table as he looked out across the estate. Fields already humming with labor, even in the half-light. The peasants bent into the earth like it had owed them something personal. And perhaps it did. The land was older than any ledger. It remembered the truth. He sipped from a silver goblet that cost more than most homes in the village. Water, not wine. Alenga liked to be sharp before the guests arrived. He would need all his wits if he wanted to make it through the midday feast without stabbing someone with a carving knife out of sheer boredom. He was, by all accounts, the kind of man other nobles either feared or wanted to marry into. He owned 4 estates, 20 horses, 1 book he could read, and more titles than he could fit on a letter without boring the messenger into madness. But despite it all, despite the silks and the spices and the stone walls that held his name in their bones, he was always looking at the world like it owed him one more secret. And he was about to find it, in the form of a letter delivered by a girl with no shoes and no last name. Lord Alenga Vale stared at the girl like she had wandered into the wrong world. She stood at the threshold of his estate with bare feet caked in river mud, a face freckled more by sun than design, and a scrap of parchment in one hand, so tightly clenched it looked like a sin she was too scared to confess. No escort, no seal, no fear either. That was the unsettling part. Poor folk were supposed to flinch when rich men looked at them too long. This one met his eyes like she was already bored of him. He took the letter from her fingers without a word. She turned and walked away before he could ask her name, her purpose, or what hellish saint had sent her up the long gravel path, past 3 guards and 2 confused hounds. He turned the parchment over. No wax, no signature, just a single sentence, written in a script he had not seen in 20 years. You remember what you buried? I remember where. He did not read it twice. He did not need to. The memory hit him like a nail through silk, soft until it hurt. He folded the letter and slipped it inside the lining of his sleeve, right above the pulse. It stayed there all morning. He held court with 2 visiting barons, agreed to sell a portion of his eastern orchard, and approved a shipment of barley to the abbey, all while the words burned against his wrists like they were written in ash. He did not ask anyone to find the girl. He knew better. You do not chase messengers like her. They find you again when they want to. By nightfall, America had not touched his dinner. He stared at the roast pheasant like it had personally betrayed him. His steward asked if he wanted music. He said no. What he wanted was a walk, alone, no lantern, no company. Just the moon, the wind, and the sound of memory trying to climb its way out of the ground. He thought it had forgotten him. He stepped out into the dark in silence and did not come back for hours. The path behind the estate was narrow, overgrown, and intentionally neglected. Lord America liked it that way. It wound through the woods in crooked silence, never built for ceremony or visitors, only for men who needed to walk without being seen. The trees knew his shape. The wind carried no judgment. The stars, well, they watched, but they never interrupted. He stopped beneath the yew tree at the bend in the path. There was nothing remarkable about the place except that it had once been the end of a different kind of life. 20 years ago, under that same tree, Ellengate Vale had made a decision that no amount of velvet or coin had ever managed to soften. A name. A choice. A bitteral or not. He never told anyone. Not his steward. Not his brother. Not even his confessor. Some truths were too fragile to survive confession. And now someone had unearthed it. He did not cry. Rich men were not supposed to cry, even when ghosts tapped on the old bones of their estate. But he did lean against the bark of the yew, like it might remember how to hold him upright. The letter had not threatened him. It had simply reminded him. That was worse. That meant whoever sent it knew him better than most living things. That meant they knew what he had done, and worse, what he had chosen not to do. When he returned to the house, his boots were soaked, his coat lined with leaves, and his expression unreadable. The steward offered him brandy. Alenga waved it away. He went instead to the study and lit the old lantern on the hearth. Then he pulled out a map of his lands, drawn before the last war, before the new tenants, before the orchard even grew its second row, and placed it on the table with slow, careful fingers. He stared at the edge of the southern wood. A red mark faded near the stream. He had drawn it himself, and only once. The room was still, but not quiet. Not really. The walls of Lord America's study had absorbed too many conversations, too many secrets muttered between candlelight and conscience. There was a hum in old wood, a kind of held breath in the space between the fire and the floor. Alenga stood over the map like a man trying to remember whether he had left a door unlocked or a sin unburied. His eyes traced the faded red mark near the stream again. The mark was old ink, the kind you only use when you think you'll never need to remember something later, the kind you regret. That part of his estate had not been touched in decades. Too rocky for planting, too close to the marsh for building. It was the sort of land you forgot to name when you bragged about your holdings. And yet, 20 years ago, it had been the most important piece of earth Elengala had ever stood on, because that was where he had met her. Rowena of Grey Hollow. A girl with no title, no coin, and a mouthful of questions that made rich men uncomfortable. She had not feared him. That was the beginning of the mistake. Or maybe it was the beginning of the truth. Hard to say now. He remembered the day as if the light itself had burned it into him. Rowena, with a handful of berries, daring him to eat one without asking what it was. She had laughed at his fine boots, smeared dirt on his sleeve just to see if he'd flinch, and he hadn't. He had smiled, truly smiled, for the first time in a long while. They met under the yew tree every week that summer, while the estate whispered and the servants kept their eyes politely elsewhere. It had not been love. Not exactly. It had been something sharper, something that pulled him out of his own name for a while. But by autumn, things changed. Rowena had asked him once quietly, with eyes too still, what he would do if someone found out. He'd said he'd protect her. He had meant it until the letter arrived. Not from her. From his brother, warning him of rumors, of talk, of the risk to the family's holdings. If America insisted on muddying his lineage, he'd gone to the U that night and waited. Rowena had not come, but her shawl was there, folded, heavy with dew, and stained with something darker than mud. No note, no goodbye. He never found her, but he had buried the shawl right where that red mark sat, now waiting. The fire had died down to a red glow by the time America moved. He folded the map like it might splinter if handled too fast, slid it into a drawer only he still used, and walked to the window that overlooked the eastern fields. Lanterns glimmered like scattered stars across the land, flickering from the hands of tired workers making their way back toward the village. He saw one trip on the stones and right themselves without pause. That was life on the estate. Stumble, recover, continue. No one had time to dwell. No one except the man who owned it all and could not stop digging up the past like it owed him peace. He did not sleep that night. He sat in the long chair in the library, the one near the old fox pelt rug, with the window cracked just enough to let in the cold. His steward passed by once, paused, then moved on. Alenga held the letter. You remember what you buried? I remember where, and let the words turn brittle in his hand. He wanted to throw it in the fire. He wanted to lock it in a box and pretend it had never arrived. But he also wanted to read it again and again, like it might change if he stared long enough. By dawn, he had made his choice. He dressed without help, pulled on a weathered cloak instead of his usual fur-lined finery, and packed a small satchel. Water, bread, a short dagger, and the map. When the servants saw him saddling his own horse, whispers bloomed like mold behind every shutter. He left the estate without announcement. No guard, no banner, no destination declared. Just the South Trail, damp from last night's frost, leading into the woods no one spoke of anymore. It was not far. No part of the land was far when it had grown over you like a second skin. But the ride felt slow, heavy, the kind of journey where every hoofstep carried more than distance. The forest took him back as if it had been waiting. Trees hunched over the trail like old men swapping stories. The yew tree came into view before he was ready for it. And yet there it was, unchanged, unbothered, its roots still twisted into the ground like it was keeping secrets no storm could shake loose. He dismounted, tied the reins to a branch, and stared at the earth where he had knelt 2 decades ago, where he had pressed a broken piece of his own life into the dirt. The earth beneath the yew was harder than he expected. Cold, tight with frost but not frozen, the kind of soil that refused to forget. Lord America knelt slowly, knees pressing into the moss, one hand bracing himself against the bark. The other reached for the dagger, not to draw it, just to feel its weight. He had no illusions about what he might find. There would be no body, no bones, just the memory of a decision that had never stopped aging inside him. He dug. Not fast, not carefully, just enough to break the surface, just enough to know if the past had shifted without him. The shawl was still there, wrapped in its oilcloth, brittle now, fraying at the corners. He exhaled like someone had finally allowed him to. His hands trembled, but he did not stop. He peeled it open and saw the fabric, faded crimson. The edge still stitched with black thread. Her thread. Rowena had stitched like she spoke, fast, uneven, unapologetic. He ran his fingers across it and found what had not been there before. A second piece of cloth, smaller, folded into the shawl's corner like an afterthought. He hesitated, then opened it. A name, a date, a line. Born late spring. The breath left his chest so fast it felt like punishment. His vision blurred, not with tears, but with the pressure of something unspoken collapsing all at once. Aline, his child. Not a rumor, not a warning. A truth hidden so carefully he had not even thought to look for it beneath the memory of what he had lost. He looked around as if the forest might offer explanation, comfort, witness. It did not. It only waited. He folded the cloth slower this time and placed it back inside the shawl. He could not bury it again. Not now. He stood, hands trembling, heart loud in his ribs, and looked south toward the edge of his land, beyond the hills, where the river bent sharp and the villages turned to names he had never bothered to remember. Somewhere out there, Aelin existed, maybe grown, maybe not, maybe carrying his face, his voice, his fire, or none of it at all, but alive. And that changed everything. Lord America did not return to the manor that night. He camped at the edge of the woods, with only the sound of owls and the brittle breath of winter trees to keep him company. The shawl stayed folded in his lap, a weight far heavier than the blade at his belt. He did not light a fire. Something about the moment felt sacred, or guilty, or both. He could still feel the thread between his life and hers, Rowena's. And now this new thread. Thinner, fragile, almost unbelievable. A line, a name he had never spoken but already belonged to his blood. He tried to recall the exact night, the weeks before Rowena vanished, her expression, the way she had touched her stomach once, distracted, then pulled her hand away, like the motion itself had betrayed her. He had not seen it for what it was then. He saw it clearly now. Not just the child, but the silence. Rowena had made her decision long before the rumors ever reached his brother's ears. She had known what would happen if the wrong person found out, and so she had vanished without asking him to be anything more than what he already was, a man too careful to risk the comfort of his name. By morning, he made up his mind. A line would not remain a question mark folded inside an old piece of cloth. She would not be a secret that only Roots remembered. He mounted his horse and rode back to the manor, not like a lord returning from an idle ride, but like a man chasing his own past down a path he had once chosen to forget. Servants scattered when they saw him, startled by the cold fire in his eyes. He spoke to no one. Not yet. He had to think. Plan. Trace every name in every village beneath his banners and ask the question, one no rich man ever dared ask, who do I owe that I never paid? By midday, he was in the records room, pulling names, midwives, servants, tenants from Grey Hollow and beyond. He did not trust the priests. He did not trust the court. He trusted the gossip of women who washed sheets, the stories of stable hands who saw too much and were paid to forget. Somewhere in those records, there was a thread, a clue, a direction, and when he found it, he would follow it. The search began in ink, pages thick with dust and misspelled names, scrolls no one had touched in years. Lord America worked through them with a focus that unsettled his steward, who stood nearby pretending to arrange shelves while clearly watching his master unravel. The records were not kind. Women listed by first names only, if at all. Children not recorded unless baptized. And most maddening of all, the years around Aelin's birth were oddly sparse, as if someone had deliberately thinned them out, erased or misplaced. It did not matter. America knew omission better than anyone. He had lived by it. He left the records and rode to Grey Hollow himself. The village had changed. More houses now, fewer fires in the street, but it still smelled like wet stone and old secrets. He kept his cloak pulled low and did not announce who he was. It was safer that way, for him and for the answers he hoped to find. He stopped at the healer's cottage first, the one Rowena used to visit when she ran out of herbs. A new woman lived there now, thin hands, sharp eyes, and no patience for nobles. But when he mentioned the name Rowena, her expression cracked. She remembered. Not the child, but the night, a man's voice raised, a girl too quiet. The next morning, a shawl left behind. Blood, yes, but not enough to bury. The girl had survived, the healer said, fled south. A carriage took her. Not a noble's, something smaller, older, paid in coin that no peasant had. She had not gone alone, the woman added. She had been carrying something, the child. She was not sure, but she remembered. Rowena's eyes set clear, like someone who had decided to vanish on her own terms. Alenga thanked her and left a coin without looking her in the eye. He stood outside the cottage for a long time after, staring down the road that led out of Grey Hollow and into the southern provinces. The wind tugged at his cloak like a whisper. He felt it now. He was close. She had lived. And if she had lived, then Elaine had too, somewhere beyond his reach. For now, the road south was longer than America remembered. Age had bent it differently. Towns had shifted, names had changed or vanished altogether. But one thing remained constant. People talked, especially when coin loosened the tongue. He paid for information in taverns with creaky floors and peeling paint, where men drank to forget and women served ale with ears wide open. Most said no, never heard of her. Some remembered a girl passing through with dark hair and a shawl too fine for her station. But only one offered a name. An old blacksmith, blind in one eye, claimed she had stopped at his forge with a baby on her hip and a question on her breath. He said she asked for directions, then left before the bread cooled. That was enough. Alenga followed the trail deeper, abandoning roads for footpaths, manor for cottage, status for instinct. He wore a simpler cloak now, traveled without an escort. He had become someone else, or perhaps for the first time, someone closer to who he had always been beneath the silk. Each village offered a piece, a girl with a new name, a child who never cried in public, a woman who refused to speak of the past. It was her. He felt it in his marrow. But each time he arrived, she had already moved on, as if she had known he might come one day and wanted to make sure he worked for it. Weeks passed. His beard thickened. His voice grew quieter, and for the first time in years he felt something closer to hunger, not for food, for reckoning. He dreamed of Rowena's voice, not in anger, in warning. Sometimes she was laughing, standing just out of reach. Sometimes she was holding a child and walking away without turning back. He always woke before the dream ended, soaked in sweat, the name Alan echoing in his ribs like a heartbeat he had borrowed too late. One morning, in a town so small it did not appear on his maps, he found a seamstress who had kept something strange, an old shawl with black stitching folded carefully inside a chest she never opened. She said a woman had traded it for thread and needles a decade ago. The woman was quiet but kind, paid in coin too clean for a peasant, left without taking the change. Alenga asked if the woman had a child. The seamstress nodded, said the girl would be near 20 now, and sharp, very sharp. Like she had been watching the world too long and was not impressed. Alenga smiled. He finally had a name. Her name, the seamstress said, was not Aelin, not anymore. She went by Mira now, a quiet name, sharp, not given, chosen. She worked with books of all things. Scribes in the southern monastery took her on as a helper when she was young, and she stayed. Not of gratitude, but because no one asked too many questions there. She copied ledgers, cataloged old sermons, wrote in 3 languages, spoke in fewer. The monks said she kept to herself, not cold, just distant, as if the world was a fire she had learned to sit near without getting warm. Alenga left that same hour. The monastery lay 2 days' ride southeast, tucked between rivers and ridges where old gods still whispered in the trees. He camped only once, barely slept, and spoke to no one. When he reached the gates, he introduced himself not as Lord Vale, but as America, a traveler seeking a scribe. The monk at the gate did not flinch, said Mara was inside tending the library. He said it like she was not special, like she was just another girl with ink on her sleeves. But America could hear the caution in his tone. She had warned them, he thought, told them someone might come. He walked into the scriptorium with slow, deliberate steps. It smelled of dust, candle wax, and the silence of old words. He saw her immediately, back turned, sleeves rolled, bent over a ledger like it held the world's last secret. Her hair was darker now, pulled back. Her hands moved like she had taught herself precision out of necessity. He did not speak, just watched. And then, without turning, she said, You took longer than I expected. It was not anger, not surprise, just fact. She stood slowly, faced him, and for a moment America forgot how to hold his posture. She had Rowena's eyes, but they were not soft. They were sharp, like a knife passed down, like a story finally ready to be told aloud. He had imagined this moment too many ways. In some, she shouted. In others, she cried. In the oldest version, she embraced him. And all was forgiven. But Mira did none of those things. She stood with her arms folded and her gaze level, like a judge who had been waiting too long to deliver a verdict. I wonder what time it is where you are. Is it the end of a long day, or are you already tucked under the blanket in the middle of the night? I'm genuinely curious. Leave a comment and let me know. No one would cheer for. Opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. There were no right words, not here, not now. So he bowed his head, not out of respect, but out of debt. She gestured to the bench beside her work. He sat slowly, like a man kneeling into the weight of his own shadow. She poured tea, ritual, not kindness, and set it between them. When she finally spoke, it was not with accusation, it was with calm, measured. She asked if he had buried her mother. He said yes, not her body, just what was left behind. She nodded, said that was expected. She had read that rich men often buried the parts of themselves that could not wear a ring. She asked if he ever looked for her. He said no. Then yes. Then said he had not known to. She tilted her head like she was watching a horse limp and deciding whether it was worth saving. She said she had known about him since she was 9, a letter her mother left, sealed in linen, hidden inside a wooden box marked with ash. She said she never burned it. She read it once a year, every year, until the words stopped hurting. Then she stopped reading. And now here he was, real, old, tired, and suddenly very small in the room where she had become someone without his name. He asked quietly what she wanted from him. She sipped her tea, watched him over the rim of the cup, then said nothing. She had wanted the truth. Now she had it. That was enough. Anything more, she said, would be for his sake, not hers. The silence that followed did not feel awkward. It felt deserved. Ilenga sat with his hands folded between his knees, staring at the floor like the stone might offer him better answers than the daughter he had come to find. Mira did not rush him. She moved around the room, returning scrolls to shelves, tidying without urgency. It was not dismissal, it was balance. She was showing him that her world did not pause simply because he had finally decided to arrive. He had come seeking something, closure maybe. But this room, her posture, her quiet, it reminded him that closure belonged to her, not him. He asked her what she remembered of her mother. Mira stopped, not dramatically, just for a breath. Then she said enough. She remembered her laugh and her eyes and the way she always left room on the table for someone who never showed up. She remembered stories about a lord who once wore his name like a secret. She remembered never being told to hate him, but also never being given a reason not to. Ilenga nodded. That was more generous than he deserved. She asked him if he had been happy. The question landed harder than anything else she could have said. He blinked, mouth parted like the answer had slipped out of reach. Finally, he said, "No, not really." There had been moments, good meals, clear mornings, but most of it had felt like he was walking inside someone else's coat. Mira nodded again. She said that made sense. His legacy had been carved by others, kings, stewards, brothers. He had inherited wealth, but not direction. And now he was old enough to recognize the difference. She poured another cup of tea and handed it to him. No smile, no warmth, just the offering of a new silence. And somehow it was the most generous thing he had received in years. They sat there for a long time. The sun shifted in the windows and the scriptorium grew darker around them, but neither of them moved to light a candle. Ilenga sipped the tea slowly, holding the warmth between his fingers like it might carry some piece of her childhood he had missed. Mira leaned against the shelf behind her, eyes not on him but on the far wall, calm, unreadable. The silence was not empty now, it was full of every step he had taken to find her, full of the years she had grown without needing him. Finally, she asked him what he planned to do next. He looked at her and did not know how to answer. He had spent so long reaching toward this moment, he had not looked past it. He said he had no plan, no map, just a name and a hope and a debt he could not repay. Mira listened, then said, that was better than most lords managed. She told him she had a room nearby if he needed a place to sleep. Nothing more, no invitation beyond the night, but a place. It was not forgiveness, it was space. That night, he lay on a narrow cot in a stone-walled room that smelled of parchment and rain. He stared at the ceiling and listened to the wind move through the cracks in the shutters. He did not feel at home, but he did not feel unwelcome. And that was something. In the quiet, he let himself imagine the girl she had been, walking through monastery halls, copying letters, watching the world sharpen her into someone who could speak plainly and hold her own silence like armor. In the morning, he woke early. Mira was already gone, tending to her work. She had left a small roll of bread on the table beside the door. No note, just food. He took it without a word, stepped out into the courtyard, and felt the light on his face. The air smelled clean, like something that had let go of winter. America did not leave the monastery right away. He told himself it was because the roads were muddy, or because the mayor needed rest, or because the cot, thin as it was quieter than his manor ever had been. But he knew the truth. He stayed because Mira let him. Not with words, with silence, with routine, with the unspoken allowance that he could exist nearby as long as he did not ask to rewrite what had already been lived without him. He watched her from a respectful distance. She moved through the world with quiet efficiency, not cold, not warm, just present. She wrote letters for the monks, tended a small herb garden, occasionally helped teach the children from the village. The children loved her, though she never spoke down to them. When one asked if she had a father, Alenga felt his stomach clench. Mira had smiled softly and said, "We all come from somewhere. Some places take longer to return to than others." The children nodded. None asked again. On the third evening, she found him sitting on the edge of the well, watching the sky shift colors. She handed him a small book, worn leather, pages crowded with neat handwriting. It was not hers, it was Rowena's. She had kept a journal. Mira had copied it herself when she was 12, not for sentiment, for survival. She said it helped her understand why her mother had chosen to vanish and why she had never spoken his name with hate. Alenga opened the book and turned a single page, then closed it. He would read it, just not yet. Not while the light was still so kind. She asked if he would be returning north. He said he did not know. Mira nodded like that made perfect sense. She told him there was no obligation. Not anymore. She had grown her roots elsewhere. But if he stayed close, she said, it would not be unwelcome. Alenga stayed, not in the monastery itself. He knew better than to impose, but in a nearby village, quiet and small, the kind of place where names traveled slower than news. He rented a modest room above a baker's shop. The woman who owned it barely looked up from her flour when he paid in coin too clean for a man wearing such worn clothes. He chopped wood to earn his keep, mended fences when the storms knocked them loose. It felt strange to work with his hands. Stranger still to realize he liked it. He visited the monastery most mornings, not always to see Mira. Sometimes just to sit beneath the trees and listen to the wind move through the chapel stones. Sometimes she would wave from the garden. Sometimes she would sit beside him. Not often and never long. But when she did, they spoke simply about the seasons, the village, the books she was restoring. He asked her nothing about her past unless she offered it. She never did, and he respected that more than he knew how to say. One afternoon, she brought him a pair of gloves she had stitched herself, not as a gift, just as something she had noticed he needed. He tried to thank her. She shrugged, said she would rather he use them than tried to make it meaningful. He nodded. Understood. That was their way. Not father and daughter, not quite. Just two people standing in the quiet space between inheritance and choice, trying not to disturb what had finally begun to settle. As spring turned, Mira mentioned a name, Ellen, softly, casually. America froze. Mira smiled, said she had taken it back recently. Mira had been the name she chose when she needed distance. Ellen, she said, felt more like her now, not because of him, because of her mother. She said it without weight, without edge, just truth. Alenga sat with that a long time, then said, "It suits you better than mine ever did." By summer, the village knew America only as the quiet man who fixed gates and paid twice what bread cost. Alan never corrected them. Neither did he. Some truths lived better unspoken, and America had come to understand that this slow, deliberate anonymity was more grace than punishment. The rhythm of the days suited him. His body ached from the work, but it was a clean ache, different from the cold, rotting guilt he had carried for years behind silk and stone. He slept better now, dreamed less, woke with purpose. Aylin continued her work at the monastery. She copied texts, trained younger scribes, and walked home alone most evenings with ink on her fingers and dust in her sleeves. Sometimes they crossed paths on the road and shared a quiet meal. Sometimes not. It never had to be more than that. She had made her peace with who she was, not with him, but with herself. And that, America knew, was the greater victory. His presence was no longer a wound, just a shadow at the edge of her life she had chosen to let stand. One day, while repairing the roof of the chapel stable, Alenga found an old pendant wedged between the stones, a small, worn circle of copper. He cleaned it, strung it with twine, and left it on the corner of Alan's writing desk without a word. She did not mention it when she saw him that evening, but she wore it the next day, not because it meant anything profound, just because it was simple, honest, uncomplicated. That was their language now. Gestures instead of explanations. Presence instead of performance. Late that week, Alan asked if he planned to return to his estate for winter. Alenga looked at her, then down at his calloused hands and said, no. He did not need to. The house was full of ghosts who had already stopped waiting for him. And besides, he added, this place, her village, her silence, her hard-earned peace, felt more like home than 1,000 stone walls ever had. The seasons turned without ceremony. Autumn swept through the hills with a slow hand, laying gold across the rooftops and sending the river into quiet retreat. The village prepared for colder nights, windows patched, roots gathered, cloaks stitched tighter. America watched it all with a kind of reverence he had never known. His old life had been driven by urgency, by show, by the hunger to keep what he never fully wanted. Here, things simply were, and that was enough. He chopped wood in the mornings, helped repair the bell tower's cracked beams, brought bread to the old farmer who had lost his hearing and still shouted greetings into the wind. No one bowed. No one asked for his titles. He never gave them. And when he passed Alan on the monastery path or caught her eyes from across the chapel courtyard, they exchanged only nods, a kind of agreement, an understanding. They were not rewriting anything. They were simply sharing what was left. One evening, she sat beside him on the hill outside the village where the grass dipped toward the river bend. No words at first, just the cold air and the hush of leaves giving up their grip. Then, softly, she asked him what his mother had been like. He blinked at the question, surprised by it. He said she had been strong, quiet, proud. Alan smiled at that, said it explained something. He asked, "What?" She just shrugged, let the silence fall again, but it was a different kind of silence, not a wall, a bridge. He told her that night about the dreams he used to have, of the Utri, of the letter, of her mother's voice saying his name in a way that never let him forget who he had once been. Alan listened, not with warmth, not with anger, just with stillness, like someone holding the last pages of a story and deciding whether to turn them or simply close the book and carry it forward. By the time winter settled over the hills, Alenga had woven himself into the rhythm of the village so gently that few remembered a time without him. He became the man who fixed what needed fixing, who said little, who always knew when to leave a room before a story turned bitter. He never asked for thanks. He never corrected anyone who called him simply Americ. Lord Vale had become a name buried under frost and distance, useful once, but no longer necessary. Alan visited less often, not out of distance, but rhythm. She was busy tending to winter records, helping prepare supplies, teaching the smaller children their letters when the monks grew too tired. It felt more like her now, not because of him, but because of her mother. She said it without weight, without edge, just truth. But every few days she would sit by the fire in the tavern where America passed most evenings. She never stayed long, just enough time to say she had been, just enough time for him to know he had not been forgotten. One evening, as snow fell against the windows in slow spirals, Alan placed a small folded page beside his mug. Not a letter, just a passage copied in her hand, a piece of her mother's writing. It said, "We do not choose the people who break us, but sometimes we get to choose who we sit beside when we heal." America read it 3 times, then folded it again and put it in his coat. He did not speak. Neither did she. But that night, the fire burned warmer than usual, and the tavern felt less like shelter and more like belonging. Later, as he walked back to his room, he paused beneath the old elm in the village square. He looked up at the stars, not searching, not begging, just remembering. His breath hung in the cold air like a question that no longer needed an answer. He placed his hand over his coat pocket where the folded note rested. For the first time in years, he felt unafraid of the past. It would not leave him, but it no longer owned him. The days shortened. The snow deepened. Fires burned longer in every hearth, and the village fell into its winter hush. Alenga moved slower now, not from age, but from awareness. Each moment felt like something worth keeping, a shared glance, a passing smile, a child running across the square in boots 2 sizes too big. These were not things he had been taught to value. But here, stripped of title and distance, he found himself collecting them like coins he had never known how to earn. Alan stopped by his room one evening. She brought no gift, no message, just herself. She stood in the doorway for a moment, then sat at the edge of the table and asked if he would walk with her. He said yes, no hesitation. They stepped out into the quiet snow, their boots sinking softly, their breath clouding the dark. No destination, just a path, just company. They walked through the orchard where the trees stood bare, their branches drawn like old maps, and for once he did not feel like a man looking for something he had lost. He felt like someone walking beside what he still had. She told him that Rowena had once wanted to write a book, not about kings or battles, just about things people forget to notice. The curve of a riverbank, the way candlelight flickers against stone, the sound of someone laughing alone. She never got the chance. Life, Eileen said, had not given her the space. But Ellen had kept that wish, and she was writing now, slowly, quietly, pages tucked in a drawer. She was not sure if it was a book or just a way to remember. Alenga told her it was already enough. They stood beneath the chapel arch as the snow began to fall again. Eileen looked up at the sky, then back at him. She said, "You can stay if you want, for the winter, For longer, no need to answer now. Just know it's yours if you choose. He met her eyes. There was no tremble in her voice, no plea, just the truth. He nodded. He did not speak. He did not need to. Some invitations live in the quiet. The days shortened. The snow deepened. Fires burned longer in every hearth, and the village fell into its winter hush. America moved slower now, not from age, but from awareness. Each moment felt like something worth keeping. A shared glance, a passing smile, a child running across the square in boots 2 sizes too big. These were not things he had been taught to value. But here, stripped of title and distance, he found himself collecting them like coins he had never known how to earn. Alan stopped by his room one evening. She brought no gift, no message, just herself. She stood in the doorway for a moment, then sat at the edge of the table and asked if he would walk with her. He said yes. No hesitation. They stepped out into the quiet snow, their boots sinking softly, their breath clouding the dark. No destination, just a path, just company. They walked through the orchard where the trees stood bare, their branches drawn like old maps. And for once, he did not feel like a man looking for something he had lost. He felt like someone walking beside what he still had. She told him that Rowena had once wanted to write a book, not about kings or battles, just about things people forget to notice. The curve of a riverbank, the way candlelight flickers against stone, the sound of someone laughing alone. She never got the chance. Life, Aelin said, had not given her the space, but Aelin had kept that wish, and she was writing now, slowly, quietly, pages tucked in a drawer. She was not sure if it was a book or just a way to remember. Eric told her it was already enough. They stood beneath the chapel arch as the snow began to fall again. Aelin looked up at the sky, then back at him. She said, "You can stay if you want, for the winter, for longer. No need to answer now. Just know it's yours if you choose." He met her eyes. There was no tremble in her voice. No plea, just the truth. He nodded. He nodded. He did not speak. He did not need to. Some invitations live in the quiet. The snow began to melt in slow veins through the hills. Ice cracked on the rooftops. Smoke rose thinner from chimneys. Spring had not arrived yet, but it had made itself known. Aline started spending more time in the fields outside the monastery, watching the soil thaw, walking barefoot across the cold mud like it grounded her. Olenga saw her from a distance and never interrupted. She had her own rhythm, her own places of stillness. He had learned not to press. He had learned that being near was sometimes louder than being needed. One afternoon, she handed him a bundle of pages, her own writing, not finished, not polished, but real. She said he could read it if he wanted to. She did not ask for praise. She did not ask for permission. He took the pages home, sat by the window, and read every word in silence. It was not about her. Not exactly. It was about leaving and staying in the thin spaces between. He recognized pieces of himself scattered throughout, not by name, but in tone, in the questions never answered. When he returned the pages, he said only this. It made him feel like he had been heard, even in the years when he had not known what to say. Alan blinked at that. Not tears, just a stillness, like the breath before you decide not to speak. She said, "Thank you," then asked if he wanted to help her bind it. He said yes, and they worked in silence for over an hour, sewing the pages together with hands that had once only known how to hold distance. Later, she placed the finished book in the monastery archive. No title, no author, just a blank cover and a note. For the ones who stayed too long, and for the ones who came late anyway. Olenga stood beside her as she shelved it. He did not touch the spine. He just watched her walk away down the aisle, quiet, confident, like someone who had finally written the last page without needing to close the book. The village shifted with the season. Roads softened. Chickens wandered farther from coops. Children returned to the fields with sticks and stories, chasing things only they could see. Life resumed without ceremony. No trumpets, no turning points. That just the slow return of what had always waited beneath the frost. Alenga began fixing fences again, repaired the bench outside the chapel, brought extra bread to the widow down the lane. He did it without thinking now. It had become part of him, service without audience. Alan kept writing. She shared none of it, not yet. But he could tell when a day had gone well by the ink on her fingers and the hum in her voice. She laughed more now, quietly, usually at herself. Once, she passed him in the square and said he still walked like a man waiting for judgment. He told her she still stared like a woman writing footnotes in her mind. They both smirked and kept walking. It was the closest thing to affection either of them knew how to carry. One morning he woke early to the sound of rain. Soft, even, patient. He stood at the window and watched it fall across the fields like forgiveness. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady. He thought of his estate, long abandoned now, stone walls standing like empty shells. He had not been back, had no need to. The place had served its time. Its wealth had taught him little. Its silence had taught him more. What mattered now was here. If these slow, quiet stories feel like a gentle breeze at night, soft enough to lull you to sleep, deep enough to stir your imagination. She asked if he wanted to help, not as a scribe, as a witness. He said, yes, not because he felt worthy, but because she had asked, and because being remembered even a little by someone like her felt like more than he had ever expected to earn. They began collecting stories slowly, not from lords or priests, but from the old woman who remembered the color of a comet 20 winters ago, from the stable boy who saw ghosts near the well, from the cook who once fed a wounded knight too ashamed to give his name. These were the stories that never made it into ledgers. They were passed from hand to mouth, soft and often wrong, but real. Aline wrote them down with care. Alenga listened, sometimes asked questions. He had spent his life living history. Now he was learning how it actually sounded. The villagers were cautious at first, but when they saw Alenga sitting with America like he was just another man with questions, they eased. They began to speak more freely. A child drew a map of the stars with charcoal and said his grandmother lived in the brightest one. A hunter told of a tree that bled when cut. A boy confessed to burying a tooth under the chapel in hopes it would make him braver. America never laughed at any of it. That was the rule. Everything shared was kept. Everything kept was respected. Some nights he and Aline worked in the little study behind the abbey. He transcribed while she filed and annotated. She teased him for his handwriting. He told her she organized like a war general. They argued once over how to record a folktale about a fox that married a widow. He said it was just nonsense. She said nonsense was sacred. In the end, they kept it exactly as it was told, with the fox, the wedding, and the quiet ending where no one asked what came next. One evening, as they closed up the room, she handed him a page she had written in a different ink. It was about a man who had arrived too late, but stayed anyway, who never asked to be forgiven, but chose to return to the place where the truth had first gone quiet. She said it was unfinished. He said it already said enough. And then they shelved it between two other stories. No title, no author, just a name scribbled in the corner small enough to miss unless you were looking. Spring arrived fully. Green spilled down the hills like a promise finally kept. The river ran louder. The monastery bells rang clearer. In the village square, someone built a new bench near the old elm, and America fixed the legs before anyone asked. Aline smiled when she saw it, said nothing, just sat there the next afternoon with a bundle of new pages in her lap. She read them aloud to a boy with mismatched shoes. He listened like it was gospel, and when she was done, he clapped, not for her, for the story. Alenga spent more time in the scriptorium now, not to write, but to sort, to read the old pages, to brush dust from truths that had waited too long to be spoken aloud. He found one scroll that told of a woman who had kept bees and secrets in equal measure. Aline laughed when she read it, said that one had to be Rowena's neighbor. They decided to include it. No edits, no clarifications, just the story as it had been given. They were building a library that remembered things the world had not known it needed to keep. One evening, a traveler stopped in the village, well-dressed, well-spoken, asked after Lord Vale, said he had heard rumors. Alenga stepped out from the tavern and met him in the square. He was not unkind, just clear. He told the man there was no Lord Vale here, just a man named Alenga who repaired benches and helped gather stories. The traveler blinked, unsure, then nodded, left the next morning, said nothing more. That was how the world worked. It forgot you if you stopped reminding it. Later, Aline told him she had overheard, asked if it had felt strange, letting go of that name completely. America shrugged. She said the name had never been the problem. It was the weight behind it, the part that made everything about owning instead of understanding. She nodded, said she had figured as much, then handed him a fresh page. A story about a man and a fox and a bench that never stayed broken for long. Spring arrived fully. She read them aloud to a boy with mismatched shoes. He listened like it was gospel, and when she was done, he clapped. Not for her, for the story. Alenga spent more time in the scriptorum now, not to write, but to sort, to read the old pages, to brush dust from truths that had waited too long to be spoken aloud. He found one scroll that told of a woman who had kept bees and secrets in equal measure. Alan laughed when she read it, said that one had to be Rowena's neighbor. They decided to include it. No edits, no clarifications, just the story as it had been given. They were building a library that remembered things the world had not known it needed to keep. One evening, a traveler stopped in the village, well-dressed, well-spoken, and asked after Lord Vale, saying he had heard rumors. Alenga stepped out from the tavern and met him in the square. He was not unkind, just clear. He told the man there was no Lord Vale here, just a man named America who repaired benches and helped gather stories. The traveler blinked, unsure, then nodded. He left the next morning, said nothing more. That was how the world worked. It forgot you if you stopped reminding it. Later, Aelin told him she had overheard and asked if it had felt strange. Letting go of that name completely, America shrugged and said the name had never been the problem. It was the weight behind it, the part that made everything about owning instead of understanding. She nodded, said she had figured as much, then handed him a fresh page, a story about a man and a fox and a bench that never stayed broken for long. Spring shifted into early summer with a kind of warmth that did not hurry anyone. The fields hummed, the stone held heat longer into the night, and the river grew louder in the evenings. The archive remained quiet, cool, and alive. Alan had begun marking the spines of the stories now, not by title, but by season. Stories told in winter went on the left, stories born in summer on the right. It was her way of letting the year shape the shelves. Ilenga asked if that was a system anyone else understood. She smiled, said that was not the point. They began receiving stories by post, letters addressed only to a line or to the archive itself. No titles, just accounts, confessions, memories someone could not carry alone. Some were unsigned. Some came folded into pressed flowers or wrapped around coins from far-off towns. One letter arrived in charcoal, written on cloth, describing a dream about a lost brother in a tower that only existed in fog. Alenga read it twice, said it reminded him of something he had forgotten to forget. One afternoon, they walked through the field behind the monastery, where bees hovered thick in the air and the wild herbs grew too tall for their names. Alan said she was thinking of building a second archive, not for written stories, but for lived ones. A garden, maybe. Each plant tied to a tale, chamomile for grief, rosemary for anger, violets for the words someone wished they had said. Alenga told her it was the most foolish idea he had heard in a decade, then added that he would help her dig. They marked the first patch with a stone from the river and a scrap of thread tied around it. Alan said it would hold the story of the woman who never stopped singing to her daughter, even after she forgot her name. Alenga planted thyme beside it, not because the story asked for it, but because it felt right. He had never liked gardening, but now, with dirt under his nails and someone beside him who did not need him to explain himself, he understood why people stayed close to the earth when words ran out. Summer deepened its hold. The sun lingered late, painting the sky in bruised oranges that made the chapel windows glow as if kindled from within. America joined the nightly gatherings less as observer and more as participant. He told a story about a lost shield found beneath a willow. The villagers listened, leaning forward, their faces lit by lanterns. When it ended, a hush fell, and someone whispered a truth he had not expected, that his voice belonged here as much as any. Aylin brought fresh pages each morning. She read the new tales aloud before filing them. Some were joyous, a child born with a throat full of song, a reunion at the old ferry crossing. Others were mournful, a horse lost to the river's current, a promise never kept, never flinched. He understood that every story, no matter how painful, was a stone in the path they had built together, each one placed precisely, leading them onward. One evening they discovered a tale stitched in embroidery rather than ink, a cloth panel depicting a knight chasing a fox into twilight. The fox looked back, grinning. The knight's armor was cracked, but he wore no helmet, no name. A line studied the stitches. Alenga traced the worn edges with his thumb. The stitches were irregular, as if sewn by someone who felt each pole. They hung it in the archive under a single lantern, no labels, just the image, inviting interpretation. Later, a line handed America a small packet. Inside, she had pressed a single foxglove. She said it reminded her of the fox in the story, beautiful but dangerous if mishandled. He nodded, understanding the warning beneath her words. He placed the flower in his coat. They closed the archive together, the lantern low, their shadows entwined on the wall, and stepped into the night, knowing the garden, the stories, and their own fragile truths would endure long after the lanterns died. By midsummer, the archive had outgrown its shelves. Ain refused to move anything. She said stories should stay where they landed. So they built more, not higher, just farther. Low shelves near the floor, wooden crates with labels carved into the sides. One read, "Stories no one believed until it rained." Another said, "Endings that arrived too early but still felt true." America helped with the carpentry. He no longer asked what belonged where. He simply carried what was given and trusted her hands to know where it should rest. The garden followed its own language. Patches of herbs and wildflowers lined the edge of the orchard, each tied to a string that led back to a page. Visitors left their own seeds now. A sprig from a lover long gone, a bitter root for a father never known, a bundle of mint from a girl who said it made her feel braver. Alenga walked the garden each morning. Sometimes he watered, sometimes he just listened. The soil had begun to sound like breath, slow, living, and grateful. One morning, Elaine found him mending a broken bench near the Abbey steps. She asked what he would do if the stories ever stopped coming. He looked up, smiled, and said that if they ever did, it would mean the world had finally learned how to listen. Until then, he had work. She nodded, then told him he had missed a nail. He raised an eyebrow and said he was testing her. She rolled her eyes. They both knew it was a lie, but it was the kind of lie that softened a long day. That evening, they sat beside the garden and watched the foxgloves lean toward the last light. Alan asked if he remembered the sound of bells from his estate. America said he remembered the echo more than the note. She asked if he missed it. He said, no, not the weight, not the walls, just the silence between the echoes. She nodded, said she had never known that silence, but she was glad he had brought it with him. It made the archive feel honest. Autumn crept back in slowly. The leaves browned early, and the wind returned with its quiet warnings. The archive stayed warm, lanterns flickering longer now, pages rustling like whispers passed from one season to the next. Alan began binding a new collection, stories from this year only. She called it The Book of Staying. Alenga did not ask why. He could already feel what she meant. Not every story was about return. Some were simply about remaining, about what grew when no one turned away. One afternoon, a boy from the village asked America if he had ever been a knight. Alenga paused, smiled, and said, "No, just someone who used to wear armor for the wrong reasons." The boy looked confused, then nodded like he understood. Anyway, Aline was nearby, organizing a stack of loose pages. She had heard, but said nothing. Later, she handed America a page drawn in charcoal, a fox sitting beside a helmet filled with flowers. No title, no explanation. He pinned it above his desk. The garden changed colors again. The strings faded. The petals curled. Aline clipped the dried heads and placed them in jars marked with initials and seasons. The roots, she said, held more than the flowers ever could. America helped her move the heavier stones. They worked quietly, the way they always had, side by side, without needing to fill the air. When the last jar was sealed, she whispered the names of each person who had left a seed behind. She did not do it for ritual. She did it because they had asked her to remember, and she did. That evening, they sat on the steps outside the archive. Aline rested her head on her knees. Alenga leaned back and looked at the sky. The stars were out early. She asked if he ever felt like his story had ended. He shook his head and said it had only finally learned how to speak without shouting. She smiled at that, said, maybe that was what most stories wanted. Not a grand ending, just a place to be quiet and still be heard. Winter returned gently. The snow arrived in pieces, not storms. The villagers moved slower now, wrapped in wool and the certainty that they were not alone. The archive stayed open. Fewer visitors, fewer pages, but more quiet. The good kind, the kind you made space for. Elaine finished her new collection and shelved it beside the first one. No fanfare, just a hand on the spine. Alenga watched her from the doorway and said nothing. Some chapters closed without sound. The garden slept beneath the frost. The jars remained, the names remained, and in the middle, a single new stone, flat, clean, unmarked, until Alan handed America a small chisel and said, "If you want, you can write something." He knelt beside it for a long time, then carved 4 words. Not a legacy, not a claim, just a truth. I stayed. She stayed too. When he stood, Alan placed a small foxglove beside the stone and smiled without looking at him. He reached for her hand. She let him. They spent that winter much like the last. Stories came slower. Days passed shorter, but something had settled. Not in the ground, in them. The rhythm no longer felt like mending. It felt like living. Alan read more. Alenga walked more. They still argued sometimes about words, about meaning, but it was quieter now, softer, like 2 voices tuning the same instrument from different sides of the room. One night, as the snow fell thick and the lanterns glowed low, Alan asked him if he was afraid of being forgotten. America said he had been once, a long time ago, when his name was louder than his actions. Now, no. Because if someone remembered the story of the man who stayed, if they spoke it aloud, even once, even wrong, it would mean he had been heard, and that was all he had ever really needed. Winter returned gently. The snow arrived in pieces, not storms. The villagers moved slower now, wrapped in wool, and the certainty that they were not alone. The archive stayed open. Fewer visitors, fewer pages, but more quiet, the good kind, the kind you made space for. Elaine finished her new collection and shelved it beside the first one. No fanfare, just a hand on the spine. Alenga watched her from the doorway and said nothing. Some chapters closed without sound. The garden slept beneath the frost, the jars remained, the names remained. And in the middle, a single new stone, flat, clean, unmarked, until Alan handed America a small chisel and said, "If you want, you can write something." He knelt beside it for a long time, then carved 4 words. Not a legacy, not a claim, just a truth. I stayed. She stayed too. When he stood, Alan placed a small foxglove beside the stone and smiled without looking at him. He reached for her hand. She let him. They spent that winter much like the last. Stories came slower. Days passed shorter, but something had settled, not in the ground, in them. The rhythm no longer felt like mending. It felt like living. Alan read more. Alenga walked more. They still argued sometimes about words, about meaning, but it was quieter now, softer, like 2 voices tuning the same instrument from different sides of the room. One night, as the snow fell thick and the lanterns glowed low, Alan asked him if he was afraid of being forgotten. Alenga looked at the fire, then at him, said he had been once, a long time ago, when his name was louder than his actions. Now, no. Because if someone remembered the story of the man who stayed, if they spoke it aloud, even once, even wrong, it would mean he had been heard, and that was all he had ever really needed. The air warmed, but slowly. Birds returned one at a time. Trees whispered with new leaves. The first daffodils broke through the frost like quiet promises. Alan added a new shelf near the door, smaller than the others. She called it the listening shelf. It held stories that had not finished yet, fragments, hopes, letters written but never sent. Alenga asked if it made sense to keep unfinished things. She said most things worth keeping are unfinished. He said that sounded like something her mother would have written. She agreed. The monastery bell cracked during a storm, and America offered to help repair it. He climbed the tower carefully, one slow step at a time, hands rough but certain. From the top, he could see the river, the fields, the edge of the garden where the old stories slept beneath wild flowers. He looked down and saw a lion waving, her coat flapping in the wind. For a brief moment, he felt like something from a story himself. Not a lord, not a penitent, just a figure who had stayed long enough to matter. That evening, Alan handed him a story written in her own voice, not copied from others. It was short, just a memory of the day she first realized he would not leave. She said she had never planned for that, but now that it had happened, it was something worth writing down. He read it slowly, heart tight in his chest, then placed it in the archive himself. No label, just the feeling that this exact story was why they built the shelves in the first place. Later, as the sky dimmed to its usual hush, Alenga stood at the garden's edge and watched the wind move through the time. He whispered a name he had not spoken in years, not his own, not hers, just one from the past, let loose into the evening like it deserved a place in the air again. And somehow, saying it no longer hurt. It just settled. The air warmed, but slowly. Birds returned one at a time. Trees whispered with new leaves. The first daffodils broke through the frost like quiet promises. A line added a new shelf near the door, smaller than the others. She called it the listening shelf. It held stories that had not finished yet. Fragments, hopes, letters written but never sent. Alenga asked if it made sense to keep unfinished things. She said, most things worth keeping are unfinished. He said that sounded like something her mother would have written. She agreed. The monastery bell cracked during a storm, and America offered to help repair it. He climbed the tower carefully, one slow step at a time, hands rough but certain. From the top, he could see the river, the fields, the edge of the garden, where the old stories slept beneath wild flowers. He looked down and saw a lion waving, her coat flapping in the wind. For a brief moment, he felt like something from a story himself. Not a lord, not a penitent, just a figure who had stayed long enough to matter. That evening, Alan handed him a story written in her own voice, not copied from others. It was short, just a memory of the day she first realized he would not leave. just a memory of the day she first realized he would not leave. She said she had never planned for that, but now that it had happened, it was something worth writing down. He read it slowly, heart tight in his chest, then placed it in the archive himself. No label, just the feeling that this exact story was why they built the shelves in the first place. Later, as the sky dimmed to its usual hush, he stood at the garden's edge and watched the wind move through the time. He whispered a name he had not spoken in years, not his own, not hers, just one from the past let loose into the evening like it deserved a place in the air again. And somehow saying it no longer hurt, it just settled. The air warmed, but slowly. Birds returned one at a time. Trees whispered with new leaves. The first daffodils broke through the frost like quiet promises. A line added a new shelf near the door, smaller than the others. She called it the listening shelf. It held stories that had not finished yet, fragments, hopes, letters written but never sent. Alenga asked if it made sense to keep unfinished things. She said most things worth keeping are unfinished. He said that sounded like something her mother would have written. She agreed. The monastery bell cracked during a storm, and America offered to help repair it. He climbed the tower carefully, one slow step at a time, hands rough but certain. From the top, he could see the river, the fields, the edge of the garden where the old stories slept beneath wild flowers. He looked down and saw a line waving, her coat flapping in the wind. For a brief moment, he felt like something from a story himself. Not a lord, not a penitent, just a figure who had stayed long enough to matter. That evening, Aline handed him a story written in her own voice, not copied from others. It was short, just a memory of the day she first realized he would not leave. She said she had never planned for that, but now that it had happened, it was something worth writing down. He read it slowly, heart tight in his chest, then placed it in the archive himself. No label, just the feeling that this exact story was why they built the shelves in the first place. Later, as the sky dimmed to its usual hush, Alenga stood at the garden's edge and watched the wind move through the time. He whispered a name he had not spoken in years, not his own, not hers. Are your eyes starting to slow down a bit, like each word is laying a soft blanket over your thoughts, pulling you gently towards sleep? Just one from the past, let loose into the evening like it deserved a place in the air again, and somehow saying it no longer hurt, it just settled. The blank book remained untouched for 3 days. Then one morning, Elaine found a single line written on the first page. The ink was still damp. Eric had written it. It said, "Today we did nothing. It was enough." She read it twice, then closed the book without adding more. That was the rule, 1 entry per day. No names, no explanations, just evidence that even the quiet deserved to be kept. Over time, villagers began adding to it too, a child's drawing, a pressed petal, a line of poetry with no author. The book filled slowly, but it never felt empty. One evening, a woman arrived from far north. She wore a coat made of 3 different kinds of cloth and carried a satchel full of stories from other towns. She had heard of the archive, she said, heard there was a place where stories were not judged, just held. Aline welcomed her in. America brought her tea. They sat together late into the night, listening to tales from frozen roads and seashed cliffs. The woman said something that stayed with America long after she left. Not every story survives to be remembered. Some survive just to be witnessed. After she left, America found himself looking out the window more often, not searching, just observing. The way the wind curled around the abbey roof, the way Aline tucked her hair behind her ear when she read, the way the bell rope swung slightly even when no one touched it. He wrote those things in the quiet book, not because they needed to be saved, but because he wanted to acknowledge they had happened, that he had been here, that he had seen them. Alan never commented on what he wrote, but he saw her turn the pages sometimes, late at night, fingers hovering, eyes still. Once she left a note inside the back cover, small handwriting, almost invisible. It read, "The story of the man who stayed is still being written, but I think the ending will be kind." The days grew long again. Warm light touched everything slower. The garden returned in full, loud with bees, soft with green. The jars stayed on the shelves, but new ones were added. A line made a section just for soundless grief. Stories that had no words, only objects, a cracked spoon, a thread from a child's coat, a page written and torn in half. Alenga helped label them, not with names but with colors. She said, "Sometimes color told the truth better than letters did." He believed her. One afternoon they found a boy sleeping in the garden with a ribbon tied to his wrist. He had walked from 3 villages over and said he heard this was a place where sadness was not dangerous. A line let him stay for a while, gave him a place to write. He never said what had driven him away from home. America never asked. But when the boy left, he placed a small stone on the edge of the time bed and said it was his whole story. And somehow, they understood. That night, Aline asked America what story he wished someone had told him when he was young. He said he wished someone had told him that staying was harder than leaving, but worth more. She said she would write that one down, but he shook his head, told her she already had, just not with words. She smiled at that, then told him his beard had gotten completely out of control. He said he was considering becoming a wild hermit. She said he already had, just cleaner. Later, they sat beside the listening shelf and watched the candle burn low. Alan leaned her head against his shoulder, not from exhaustion, but from knowing it was safe to do so. Alenga looked at the garden, the archive, the shelves that leaned slightly, the world they had made by staying, and he whispered, "This is what it feels like to be kept." The days grew long again. Warm light touched everything slower. The garden returned in full, loud with bees, soft with green. The jars stayed on the shelves, but new ones were added. A line made a section just for soundless grief. Stories that had no words, only objects. A cracked spoon, a thread from a child's coat, a page written and torn in half. Alenga helped label them, not with names, but with colors. She said, "Sometimes color told the truth better than letters did." He believed her. One afternoon, they found a boy sleeping in the garden with a ribbon tied to his wrist. He had walked from 3 villages over and said he heard this was a place where sadness was not dangerous. A line let him stay for a while, gave him a place to write. He never said what had driven him away from home. Alenga asked, but when the boy left, he placed a small stone on the edge of the time bed, said it was his whole story, and somehow they understood. That night, Alan asked what story he wished someone had told him when he was young. He said he wished someone had told him that staying was harder than leaving, but worth more. She said she would write that one down, but he shook his head, told her she already had, just not with words. She smiled at that, then told him his beard had gotten completely out of control. He said he was considering becoming a wild hermit. She said he already had, just cleaner. Later, they sat beside the listening shelf and watched the candle burn low. A lion leaned her head against his shoulder, not from exhaustion, from knowing it was safe to do so. America looked at the garden, the archive, the shelves that leaned slightly, the world they had made by staying, and he whispered, "This is what it feels like to be kept." The next story they received came without words at all. A basket of river stones, each one painted with a symbol, some stars, some eyes, one with just a crack down the center. Aline studied them like she was reading a new language. Alenga simply sat beside her and listened to the space between her thoughts. She eventually placed them in a bowl on the archive table. When a child asked what they meant, she said, "Everything you want them to." That was enough. America found himself rising earlier. He swept the floor before Elin arrived, He restacked the books that leaned too far. He dusted the ledges where old cobwebs waited for no one. These tasks were small, but they felt like stitches. He did not think of the man he had once been, not often, but when he did, it was not with shame. It was with a kind of distant gratitude for the distance itself, for the fact that it no longer defined him. Alan began teaching others how to tend the archive, not as a sign of stepping away, but of trust. The stories would outlast them both. She taught the new keepers how to listen with their hands, how to read silence, how to recognize truth when it arrived without armor. Alenga watched her teach and thought of Rowena, thought of how legacy was never built in bloodlines, only in what you left open for others to continue. One evening, as the garden breathed soft in the twilight, Ain asked him if he had ever wished for a different life. He thought for a long time, then said, once, many times, until he realized the life he had now could not have happened without the one that came before. She nodded, said that was how the archive worked too. The shelves needed the empty spaces, otherwise nothing would ever settle. The next story they received came without words at all. A basket of river stones, each one painted with a symbol, some stars, some eyes, one with just a crack down the center. Aline studied them like she was reading a new language. America simply sat beside her and listened to the space between her thoughts. She eventually placed them in a bowl on the archive table. When a child asked what they meant, she said, "Everything you want them to." That was enough. Alenga found himself rising earlier. He swept the floor before Aelin arrived. He restacked the books that leaned too far. He dusted the ledges where old cobwebs waited for no one. These tasks were small, but they felt like stitches. He did not think of the man he had once been, not often. But when he did, it was not with shame. It was with a kind of distant gratitude for the distance itself, for the fact that it no longer defined him. Alan began teaching others how to tend the archive, not as a sign of stepping away, but of trust. The stories would outlast them both. She taught the new keepers how to listen with their hands, how to read silence, how to recognize truth when it arrived without armor. Alenga watched her teach and thought of Rowena, thought of how legacy was never built in bloodlines, only in what you left open for others to continue. One evening, as the garden breathed soft in the twilight, Elaine asked him if he had ever wished for a different life. He thought for a long time, then said, once, many times, until he realized the life he had now could not have happened without the one that came before. She nodded, said that was how the archive worked, too. The shelves needed the empty spaces. Otherwise, nothing would ever settle. The first snow came before anyone expected it. Not heavy, not harsh, just a thin veil across the stones and leaves. The garden stilled. The archive took on its winter hush. Aelin dusted the windowsills with slow care. Alenga lit the lanterns one at a time. They moved without speaking, the way people do when every motion is already understood. Outside, the village sank into the season with the quiet ease of a place that had learned how to wait. A new visitor arrived that afternoon. Young, unsure, eyes wide, they asked if this was the place where lost things were kept. A line said, yes. The visitor held out a page, creased, smudged, handwritten, a story about someone who left and someone who stayed behind and kept the fire lit. Anyway, America took the page, nodded once, and placed it on the new shelf marked "Still Warm." The visitor smiled, lingered, and then stepped back into the cold with lighter steps. That night, Elin and America sat by the fire one more time. She held the old ledger where she had first written her mother's name. He held a blank page, just one. He said he was not sure what to write anymore. Ellen said maybe that meant the story had been told well. He smiled, placed the page back in the drawer, and let the silence finish the sentence for him. Outside, the snow fell slower, and the wind hummed like it knew how the story ended, and that it would be told again. Later, Alan placed a stone beside the first garden marker. No words, just the shape of a small fox carved gently into the face. She stepped back, looked at America, and said nothing. He did not need her to. He stood beside her, no coat, no title, just stillness, just presence. And together they let the snow fall and the stories stay. Sleep is arriving softly now, like the end of a day slipping into dusk. Thank you for staying with me this far. Sleep well, and I'll be here with another story on another quiet night.